New England regional release of Environment America's new report, Offshore Wind for America. We're going to be joined by some excellent offshore wind experts and leaders in the field, and we'll be taking some questions at the end. So just to go through the agenda really quick, first I'll be sharing an overview of some of our key findings from the report today and a general overview. And then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Ben Hellerstein and Anya Smith, who are our state directors for our state chapters of Environment Massachusetts and Environment Maine, respectively. And then I'll turn it over to some of our excellent guest speakers. So today, the US gets over 11.5% of our electricity from renewable sources, and that's a lot of progress that we've made from over 2 decades ago. In 2001, we were just getting over 0.5% of energy from our renewable resources. And we know that we can make it to a 100% renewable energy future. And to get there, we can utilize a really massively underutilized resource off of our coasts, and that's offshore wind. So in the report, we examined the technical potential of offshore wind in the US, and we found that the US has a technical potential to produce more than 7,200 terawatt hours of electricity for offshore wind. And what we did is we compared that to both our electricity use in 2019 and the potential electricity use in 2050, assuming that we transition society to run mostly on electricity rather than fossil fuels. And what we found is that offshore wind could power our US 2019 electricity use almost 2 times over. And in 2050, we could power almost 90% of those electricity needs. So we have a lot of offshore wind waiting right off our coasts, and we just need to take advantage of it. 19 of the 29 states that we examined with offshore wind potential actually have the potential to produce more electricity from offshore wind than they used in 2019. And of those 29 states, 11 could actually produce more electricity than they'd be using in 2050, again, assuming that we transition to run mostly on electricity rather than fossil fuels. And to go into the bigger picture of how this fits in, every coastal region of the United States has offshore wind potential, and each region has different opportunities and obstacles to offshore wind development that vary. And as you can see here, the Atlantic is the clear front runner in terms of the amount of potential it has for offshore wind. It can actually power its own 2019 electricity use over 4 times over with offshore wind. And the rest of the states, or the regions, follow. The Gulf has a lot of potential, as well as the Pacific and Great Lakes. In the Pacific, we'll need a lot of floating offshore wind to accommodate those large drop-off areas and narrow coastal regions. And the other regions follow as well. We know that offshore wind is advanced and proven, and it's widely deployed in Europe and Asia and continues to improve. We know that there's over 5,000 turbines currently deployed around the world with more than 27 gigawatts of installed generation capacity. And that's actually enough to power over 7.3 million US homes. And on average, turbines are now 12 times more powerful than when they were first deployed in 1991. And the technology is really continuing to improve. So we're expected to see a lot of growth in the US for offshore wind. In terms of where the US is right now, we only have 2 operational projects right now in the US, but we have a lot of projects in the pipeline. We have 34 proposals for our offshore wind development and 27 projects in various stages of planning and development. And together, it totals more than 26 gigawatts of site capacity. And as I mentioned before, we are expected to see a lot of growth in offshore wind in the US. But we know that we can do more, and we can help repower the US with clean energy using offshore wind. We just have to take advantage of it and be bold. So to help the industry grow and to hasten that transition to renewable energy, our governments and our regulatory bodies can do a lot to help make that happen, including setting really bold and enforceable targets at the state level, helping to accelerate the permitting and the leasing process to ensure timely development. We can also increase and extend our tax credits for offshore wind. We can collaborate by region to ensure responsible and efficient development. And we can also help foster those new technologies to help the turbines become even more powerful and efficient so that we can generate more energy out of smaller areas. And these are including, but not limited to, these tools. And there's a number of ways we can help make a difference with offshore wind. So now, how does New England fit into this picture? Well, actually, out of every single state in the US, Massachusetts has the highest potential offshore wind generation capacity. And Maine actually has the highest ratio of potential generation capacity to the amount of electricity that it uses. So we have some real front runners here in New England, and we have a huge opportunity to take advantage of this resource. And when you look at New England as a region, it could generate more than 5 times its projected 2050 electricity demand, again, assuming that we transition mostly to run on electricity rather than fossil fuels. So we are positioned really, really uniquely to take advantage of this resource here in New England, and we know that we can go big on offshore wind. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Ben Hellerstein, who is our State Director for Environment, Massachusetts. Ben, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Hannah. And yeah, I just wanted to give a big thank you to my colleague, Hannah, for organizing today's event and spearheading our national campaign for offshore wind. And thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time to join us today and share your perspectives. At Environment, Massachusetts, we envision a future powered by 100% renewable energy, and offshore wind is a big part of how we get there. Massachusetts has the highest offshore wind potential of any state in the country, as Hannah said. Our potential is more than 20 times our current electricity use and more than 8 times our projected electricity use in 2050 once all of our heating and transportation are shifted from fossil fuels to electricity. So we have this tremendous resource that we're just beginning to tap into. It has been a long road to bring offshore wind to Massachusetts, and the end is finally in sight. The Vineyard Wind project, which will be the first large-scale offshore wind project in the country, is moving ahead, and there's basically just one more federal regulatory sort of a box to check before that project can begin. And when that's operational, that project alone will produce about 6% of our electricity in Massachusetts. So it's a really important first step, and we're celebrating this progress. And we also know that we need to go a lot further to achieve a future powered entirely by renewable energy. So we're proud to work with Environmental League of Massachusetts. We're going to hear from Susanna later, as well as many other partners to go big on offshore wind in Massachusetts. So again, just to reiterate, we envision a future powered by 100% renewable energy, and offshore wind is going to play a big role in how we get there. So with that, I'll hand it back to Hannah.
Thanks so much, Ben. I'll now turn it over to Anya, who is our State Director in Environment, Maine. Anya, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hannah. So I primarily want to highlight from this report, as Hannah mentioned, that Maine has the highest ratio in the country of technical potential energy from offshore wind. So in terms of the amount that we could generate versus the electricity that we actually use. And that's the case for not only the year that we looked at, 2019 to 2020, but also for our projected electricity use in 2050. So those percentages are very high. It's a 3,505%. And then in 2050, it would be 1,338% is the ratio of potential energy to electricity use. So we're really excited for the amount that we could do. That means that, it could power Maine over many times. Obviously, that's not, we have other options as well for clean renewable energy, but just the potential there is really exciting. And looking forward, especially to the floating offshore wind research array with Aquaventus, the 12 turbines that will be put out so we can find out more about how well floating offshore wind turbines can work for us, especially with the added benefits of being able to move them, put them in very specific places, and also have a minimized impact on the environment. So really excited. We have from UMaine today, we have Dr. Hebby Dauger, who will be talking a lot more about that. But the important thing to note here as well is that while we have a huge potential here in Maine, we really can't do it without collaborating with the region and of course the rest of the country. So I'm really glad to be here and working with a number of other states in our New England region to make sure that offshore wind becomes a really important part of our goal to reach 100% renewable energy. really lines up well with Maine's recent release of the Climate Action Plan, and I look forward to Maine being a leader and New England being a leader in offshore wind. So I'll hand it back to you, Hannah. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anya. I'd now like to introduce our first guest speaker, Susanna Hatch, who is the Clean Energy Coalition Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, and she also is the regional lead for our New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. So Susanna, take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Environment America and Hannah and team for inviting me to speak today. Today, my remarks will focus on two things: the context of offshore wind in Massachusetts, to give everyone a little background, and the importance of regional collaboration, as Anya just mentioned. So Massachusetts was the first mover on large-scale offshore wind in the United States. In 2016, it was the first state to pass a law requiring the procurement of large-scale offshore wind with the Energy Diversity Act, and subsequently doubled that commitment following 2018 legislation. Now, the offshore wind industry is growing in leaps and bounds in the United States, and that growth and investment is driven by similar state-level procurements in states up and down the East Coast from Massachusetts to Virginia. It has become an increasingly competitive market for all of these states that want a piece of this great pie. That first procurement legislation in Massachusetts resulted in 2 contracts with 2 different offshore wind developers, Vineyard Wind and Mayflower Wind. And as Ben mentioned, Vineyard Wind is nearing the end of its federal permitting process and hopes to start construction next year and to come online in 2023. So as Ben mentioned, this will be the nation's first large-scale offshore wind project. Other than 2 turbines in federal waters off of Virginia and 5 in state waters off of Block Island in Rhode Island, the United States has yet to seize the potential of offshore wind. This is, of course, in contrast to Europe, which has over 5,000 turbines installed, as Hannah mentioned, and Asia, which is quickly becoming an epicenter of the offshore wind boom as well. So that's a little information about how this all started in Massachusetts and what's happening now. First, we're about to see Massachusetts offshore wind commitments further increase to 5,400 megawatts with, fingers crossed, the passage of the next generation climate bill in the next week or 2. The state also recently started its next offshore wind solicitation process, this time for an amount of offshore wind that is double what each of the previous 2 contracts were. We expect the winning contract to be selected this fall with a final announcement next spring after negotiations with the winning bidder. And in the state legislature, we're supporting a bill this session with our coalition partners called the Power Act on the House side. It will focus on shaping the industry in Massachusetts such that it's responsible, equitable, and maximizes local economic benefits. So all that to say, there's a lot of offshore wind activity going on in Massachusetts. And given that the state found that we'd need at least 15 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050 in Massachusetts alone to meet our decarbonization targets, we expect that activity to continue to ramp up, which is why it's of utmost importance that we ensure that we're shaping the industry in a way that will be sustainable and will maximize local economic benefits while protecting the environment, wildlife, and our local communities. Which brings me to my second topic. As Hannah mentioned in my introduction, I'm also the regional lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. It's a growing regional coalition of over 75 organizations, including environmental advocacy organizations, academic and research institutions, justice and health organizations, business alliances, and labor unions. Several of my fellow speakers, including Environment America and its state level organizations, Green Energy Consumers, and Maine, are all members of this coalition. Coalition members hail from all 6 New England states and are working together to advocate for responsibly developed offshore wind in our region. We believe that offshore wind is the single biggest lever that we can pull to reduce our emissions, address the climate crisis, meet our energy needs, and grow our economy simultaneously. And we aim to drive governors and legislatures to support regional collaboration and more offshore wind procurements, building the political will to power every home in New England with responsibly developed offshore wind by the mid-2030s. So digging a little deeper into the regional approach, as Anya spoke about, and why we're focused on that. First, New England shares the same regional electricity grid, so it makes sense to collaborate regionally solely based on that. But there are many other reasons regional collaboration between the New England states is important for offshore wind. It would unlock economies of scale and drive down prices, accelerate development, increase local economic benefits, and improve project outcomes across our shared grid. There are numerous challenges to bringing offshore wind to the scale needed to mitigate climate change, and each of those challenges could be better addressed with a regional approach, from transmission to wildlife protection to port infrastructure, and many more. Regional collaboration is necessary for attaining New England's potential to be a leader in offshore wind. Our coalition is proud of the early state procurements in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, but our leadership has been eclipsed by the states to our south, and we have a better chance at being leaders in offshore wind and seeing increased economic benefits if we work together and punch above our weight. So as Environment America's report makes clear, offshore wind has enormous potential in New England, and we need to move forward with urgency and seize that opportunity in order to address the climate crisis. And we can do that best if we work together. So thank you again, Environment America, for asking me to speak, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Susanna. We'll now transition to our next speaker, Dr. Hebby Dauger, who is the founding executive director of UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composite Center. And I will let him share some slides with you now. Dr. Dauger, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today to be part of this presentation, and thank you for all the work that the Environment USA is doing. I'm going to focus on technology today. I'm the engineer in the team, if you wish, and talk about floating technology in particular. The state of Maine has deep waters off its coast, so if you go about 3 nautical miles off the coast of Maine, you're in about 300 feet of water. And therefore, you really can't use fixed bottom turbines like that's been developed in Europe and in other places. But Maine isn't unique in that as well. Many other parts of the Northeast United States also have deep waters as you get farther from shore. So for the last 13 years, we've been working on floating wind turbine technologies and deploying them and testing them so we can harness this wonderful resource off of our coast. What does a floating turbine look like? This is an example of the design that we've developed. It's called the semi-submersible floating turbine. It floats like a boat does. Imagine a boat holding up a wind turbine. In this case, it's a boat with actually 3 hulls, 1, 2, and 3. It's like a trimaran versus a catamaran that would have 2 hulls. And part of the hull is under the water, part of the hull is above the water. And it's tied to the seabed with mooring lines. In this case, you could see 3 mooring lines, 1 on each corner of the hull. And then the power comes back to shore through a cable, and the cable comes down from the turbine down the tower and through the hull, and makes a lazy wave, if you wish, with some buoyancy modules, and that's called a dynamic cable, and goes to the seabed and eventually makes it to shore. But that's a dynamic cable that's very important in the design because it has to follow the hull as the hull moves around, because this hull is not static. It's moving as the wind and waves blow on it. This is some of the work, some of the facilities of the University of Maine that we've designed and developed to help move this industry forward. This happens to be a wind blade test that we're doing in our laboratory to validate next generation wind blades. This happens to be about a 160-foot wind blade. And notice we do this for about a month to 2 months to represent about 20 years of life. And that's how we can determine these turbines will hold up in our end-use environment. Another facility we've built is a wave wind basin. It's the first of its kind in the world, and certainly the first in the US. There are a lot of wave basins in the United States. There's a lot of wind tunnels, but nobody's put the 2 together. So this is an open jet wind tunnel over a wave basin, and right in front of it, you see a floating turbine. And that's being tested, in this case, at a 150 scale of its actual size. Here's what it actually looks like. So this is the wave generation equipment that's creating waves in the wave basin, just like a wave pool that maybe you've been at when you were a child, but it's the scientific version of a wave pool where we can actually create specific wave heights and wave frequencies, and wave directions can come from different angles. And We can create 50-year storms and 500-year storms relative to the size of a hull. In this case, you'll see a hull in a 50-year storm. In this case, that's a floating hull that's subjected to both winds and waves. So that's how we develop these technologies in the lab before we take them to the field. Now, how much potential for floating wind is there in the US? The dark blue areas, the areas are too deep to use fixed bottom turbines on. And you can see off the coast of Maine, we really don't have very much light blue areas. We have to use floating wind if we're going to have offshore wind in Maine, and that's why we started working on that. But if you go down to Massachusetts, as you've heard from our prior speaker here, there's an interest to grow and do more offshore wind off Massachusetts. And eventually we're going to run out of space to put fixed bottom turbines. We have to start looking at floating also off Massachusetts coast and beyond in the rest of the Northeast. On the West Coast, of course, you can see it's all deep waters. They only have one choice on the West Coast is floating turbines. Now, in terms of the state of Maine, we did some numbers, ran some numbers about 13 years ago and kept updating these numbers, but the state of Maine spends between 3.6 and 5.8 billion dollars per year on fossil fuels. The majority of that leaves the state of Maine. That's heating oil, gasoline, natural gas, and so forth. And what we determined that if we were to harness just 3% of the offshore wind resource within 50 miles of the Gulf of Maine, we can heat every home and drive every car. So 3% of the Gulf of Maine area can allow us to electrify heating and transportation in the state. Now, I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm just suggesting there's a huge potential, if you wish, to do that. What we'd have to look at is a basket of solutions from a renewable perspective. Now, what does a floating turbine look like? There's 3 different categories of floating turbines. And ironically enough, we have to thank the oil and gas industry for developing floating structures. And we borrowed designs from the oil and gas industry and adapted them to floating turbines. There's something called a spar, which is like a long tube that has a very deep, in this case, draft of close to 300 feet. A semi-submersible design that would have a final draft of about 60 or 70 feet, and a tension leg platform that utilizes essentially tension legs anchored to the seafloor to keep it stable. In our case, we chose a semi-submersible to be used in the Gulf of Maine because of the low draft that it has, because you can assemble that dockside and tow it out to sea. Here's the first floating turbine, actually, or the first offshore wind turbine that was connected to the US grid. It was actually in the state of Maine. So Maine made history in 2013 where we actually plugged in the first offshore wind electrons into the US grid. And that was a 1:8 scale version of a full-size floating turbine that we designed and built in our lab and deployed then. And that's how we towed it out the Penobscot River in Maine down to sea. It was prefabricated dockside and towed out to sea, just like what we would do in the future with floating farms. The beauty of floating is you can actually make everything dockside and tow it out and moor it to the seabed. And that allows us to do most of the work dockside and reduce the costs. The unit was towed out to sea, and it arrived in Castine, was moored to the seabed, and we had it there for 1.5 years with about 50 sensors on board to see how it moves with respect to the wave and the wind, and to see if our numerical tools really work and really predict what happens. And this happens to be a 50-year storm in December of 2013. It was called Winter Storm Electra. What you see blowing across actually is snow. And it was a 50-year storm relative to the size of the hull. A 50-year wave in the Gulf of Maine is about 60 feet high from peak to trough. So relative to the size of this hull, imagine a 60-foot wave coming at it. And you can't really barely see it move. And that was the purpose of the design, is to design a hull that can float, yet will not move a lot and protect the turbine. And what we found that is in a 50-year, 500-year storm, this hull would move off vertical less than 7 degrees. So it's a good design. And as a result of that, success of this program, the US Department of Energy funded us with $50 million to build the first full-size one. And that's what we're working on now. So we're partnered with 2 companies, RWE, the second largest offshore wind developer in the world, and as well as the Mitsubishi Corporation, the Diamond Generating Corp, to build this hull. And the goal is to start construction next year and get it up and running by 2023. Fingers crossed. Okay. Now, how do you moor that to the seabed? The hull is moored with mooring lines, as I said earlier. But at the end of the mooring line, there's different anchors you could use. This is one of the anchors we're looking at. It's called the drag anchor. It looks like a big plow, essentially. You drag it down the seabed, embeds itself into the mud, and gives you that pull-out strength that you need. The beauty of that is there's no noise when you put that in. You don't have to actually jackhammer anything to the seabed or pound anything, piles and so on and so forth. And then later on, you can pull it out the same way by pulling in the other direction. So it's very easy to get it in and out if you wish, the hull, the mooring line. The hull is made out of concrete, so we can make it locally. That's how we designed the technology that can be fabricated locally. And it's built like a bridge, using segmental concrete construction. So our goal is to turn bridge builders into hull builders. That's what the technology allows us to do. And you know, there's a lot of bridge builders across the United States that build concrete bridges, and they could actually be building hulls. The other advantage of concrete technology that we're using is we're planning for 3 to 4 life cycles for the hull, versus instead of using a hull that has a 25-year life, like we would do with steel, we're looking at a hull that can have a 100-year life. So every 25 years or so, you can come back and tow the hull back to shore and put a new turbine on and send it back up. And that would reduce significantly the environmental footprint of the concrete construction that we have. And finally, we're doing a lot of work on environmental and ecological impacts of floating wind. With the project off Monhegan Island, where we plan to put the single turbine, we have done years of environmental evaluations of the site. We've studied who lives under the water, who lives above the water, tagged the fish and tagged the birds and figured out where they go, where they feed. And when we bring the hull back in, we'll be able to see what difference that the hull will make to the environment around it. That's part of the engineering work or environmental work that we're doing. The state, of course, is moving on to do a larger project, 10 to 12 turbines, and that would help us, again, crawl before we walk and walk before we run. Start with 1, then put in 10 to 12, and learn the environmental, ecological impacts, learn how to work with the fisheries, learn how to better site these things before we go out and do bigger projects in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Dauger. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, Kai Salem, who is the policy coordinator at the Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I'm just going to share my screen with you all again. Wonderful. And again, just to remind everybody, we will be taking questions from press at the end, so be thinking of those as you're listening. Kai, take it away.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Kai Salem. I'm the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Green Energy Consumers is a nonprofit advocacy organization based in Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. We work to accelerate the transition to a low carbon future. We also manage a bunch of different energy programs for everyday energy consumers in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. As a policy advocate, I work on all sorts of energy policy in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island with a focus on electric grid and energy efficiency. We are a member of the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, and offshore wind in both states is one of our priorities because of its importance to decarbonizing the grid. I'll also mention that I am the Vice President of Policy at the Environment Council of Rhode Island, which is a coalition of organizations in Rhode Island, kind of an umbrella environmental organization that works to advance the work of environmental advocacy organizations in our state. Today, I'll mostly focus on the importance of offshore wind to Rhode Island, and I'll get into that. So as you all know, Rhode Island is proud to be the home of the nation's first offshore wind project. Deepwater Wind came online in 2016 after a many-year-long process to plan for, procure, and build this project. Deepwater Wind is a symbol of Rhode Island's commitment to climate action and to offshore wind as the future of our energy system, a job creator, and a source of innovation in our state. That 5-turbine and 30 megawatt project is, of course, a very small project compared to both what we expect to come online in the next decade and the extraordinary potential that is highlighted by this Environment America report. But it's still important because it was the first, and Rhode Island continues to consider itself a leader on offshore wind. Today, there are a number of other projects, or two main ones to mention, that are coming up in Rhode Island. First, the Revolution Wind project is a 400 megawatt project whose power purchase agreement was approved in 2019. It is currently in the permitting and review process. Its construction and operations plan is in progress at the Department of the Interior, and its environmental impact statement is planned to be heard in the coming years. Most recently, Governor Raimondo, who recently moved to become part of the president's cabinet, so she's no longer at Rhode Island. We have a new governor as of last week. Governor Raimondo announced a 600 megawatt RFP, so a request for a 600 megawatt project to be built for Rhode Island to supply that much electricity to the state for another offshore wind project. That RFP is still in review, and we hope to see it come from the utility company and Office of Energy Resources sometime soon. Rhode Island needs offshore wind to meet its climate goals. It's critical. Rhode Island is on a race to decarbonize, like all of our neighboring states and like the whole world. Most recently, the Act on Climate, which is a landmark piece of climate legislation, passed the Rhode Island Senate, and it's actually at a vote in the Rhode Island House this afternoon. I mentioned that bill partly because it's the most important piece of climate legislation to ever be considered in Rhode Island. This bill would accelerate Rhode Island's rate of decarbonization, and it would also make our climate goals binding and enforceable. That means that the government actually has to start taking climate action seriously, and offshore wind is at the center of that work. If we are to successfully decarbonize our electric sector, we need affordable, reliable, and clean electricity, and that's going to come from offshore wind. Just the last couple of months, I think in December, the Brattle Group released a study partnering with our Office of Energy Resources that laid out the different pathways to getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. That study revealed that offshore wind is a big part of the most affordable pathway to that goal. And that, I mean, you can see the picture start to become clear. The governor released the 600 megawatt RFP. The study indicates that offshore wind will be at the central of our decarbonization goals. And now we're working on passing a 100% renewable energy standard by 2030. That policy would keep us accountable to that clean electricity goal. We do have other renewable resources in Rhode Island, but offshore wind has the most potential for creating jobs, delivering affordable electricity, and minimizing the burden on areas of environmental concern. Rhode Island is a very small state, and we just don't have the room to build out solar, for example, to meet those carbon goals. But there's so much potential in offshore wind, and we're really excited for offshore wind to be a piece of the puzzle in decarbonizing. Offshore wind is supported by labor across the state. I want to particularly highlight a new group, Climate Jobs Rhode Island, which is a partnership between environmentalists in Rhode Island, legislators, and a whole suite of labor groups, including the AFL-CIO. They're supporting offshore wind because of the potential for jobs. And that is a really special part of the work of offshore wind in Rhode Island. Also, because we're a small state, we rely heavily on collaboration with our neighboring states. Revolution Wind, the second project planned for Rhode Island, was procured jointly with the state of Connecticut. Although our next procurement is planned to be Rhode Island going it solo, Rhode Island does work with other states on transmission planning. We rely on other states' expertise on environmental protections and other components of putting these offshore wind projects together. There is a new governor in Rhode Island, and for anyone who saw the news this morning, National Grid, which is the one utility company in Rhode Island, the one investor-owned utility company, is selling its Rhode Island business to a new company. So I think over the next year, we're going to see a lot of change in how Rhode Island approaches offshore wind and its climate goals. However, we are confident that offshore wind will remain a central part of our approach to decarbonization, and Rhode Island will continue to work with other states around the region in our work to bring offshore wind to Rhode Island, to bring those great jobs to Rhode Island, and to decarbonize our electricity. Our policy priorities to support offshore wind include passing the Act on Climate to get those binding carbon goals, passing a 100% renewable energy standard to make sure that we're moving towards clean electricity. Offshore wind will, of course, be a part of that. And on the regulatory side, make sure that offshore wind is being sited and built in a way that is most beneficial to Rhode Islanders and Rhode Island's natural resources. So we're thrilled to see all of this offshore wind potential and to work with people around the region on bringing this new technology to Rhode Island.
Thanks so much, Kai. We'll now transition to our last speaker, and I'd like to introduce Shiloh Felton, who is the Field Manager of the Clean Energy Initiative at the National Audubon Society. And I'll also let her share some slides with you now.
Okay, am I sharing? You can see my slide there? Great.
Yep, great.
Thank you to Hannah and to Environment America for inviting me to speak today. I am the Eastern US Field Manager for Audubon's Clean Energy Initiative, and that means I advise on a handful of offshore wind and other clean energy projects to make sure that they're better for birds. We know that climate change is a bird issue. Audubon's climate report documents the predicted range losses of 389 species if we fail to address climate change. As an example, northern gannets have a current breeding range along the northeastern US and Canada. This map over here shows the predicted range of the species by 2050 if we fail to take action today and allow global temperatures to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The red indicates parts of the current range that are expected to be lost. And while there is still time to make sure we don't surpass this number, climate change operates on a delay. So regardless of our actions today, species like northern gannets are likely to experience range losses to a similar degree to the ones shown on this map. And if we continue to fail to take action, we are predicted to reach 3.0 degrees Celsius by 2080, at which point very little range remains hospitable for breeding for northern gannets. So we need to act to mitigate these effects, but we also need to acknowledge that climate change is and will continue to affect these species moving forward. And therefore, it's also essential that we limit additional pressures on these populations. I've highlighted northern gannets because they also occur in both the UK and in the eastern United States offshore. This map over here shows the range of the wintering northern gannets in the eastern US and overlays that with our planned, with the planned locations for offshore wind in the Atlantic coast. And the lighter colors indicate higher density of these birds. Northern gannets, based on what we know in the UK, experience both direct and indirect risks from offshore wind. So direct risks are things like collision, indirect risks are things like habitat loss. Other types of displacement include, barrier effects. So if a bird is migrating over, traditionally migrating over an area that might be occupied by offshore wind, they may be rerouted, and that would be an energy cost. But because we have not yet developed offshore wind in the US to a large degree, we don't have any utility scale projects yet, we don't really know how the build out in the United States is going to impact US species. And so that requires us to take this adaptive management approach where we monitor impacts as we build out so that we can understand what those impacts are from utility scale solar developments in the United States and then adapt to those changes or adapt to that new knowledge. And that's going to require a regional scale approach. Some of the methods that we use for understanding these potential impacts are really broad scale and require coordination. So for example, a network of passive radio telemetry receivers across the coast and deployed within wind farms could allow us to track movements of even small songbirds and terns, like roseate terns, which are endangered, so that we can understand better how birds are using the wind development areas and how those movements might be changing. But this requires deploying these kinds of receivers in the offshore environment. This also requires a regionally coordinated effort to get tags on individual birds. And this can help us to better understand collision risk, but we'll also need other technologies on wind turbines themselves in order to detect actual collision events and measure rates of collision. And that kind of technology requires a coordinated effort, coordinated funding, in order to drive a market to even produce those. Boat and aerial surveys conducted before and after construction are the best way to measure if populations of birds are losing habitat as a result of wind farm development. And this habitat loss is not restricted to the wind farm footprint, unfortunately. It has sort of a distributed effect. So we know from wind farms in Europe that some species may even avoid ocean area surrounding wind farms for up to 20 kilometers. Not every species experiences habitat loss to that degree, but that is documented in species like kittiwakes. Many of the current offshore wind lease areas are adjacent or very close together. And right now, developers are responsible for putting into practice their own monitoring and developing their own monitoring regimes. But at a regional scale, if we had a regional monitoring effort, we would be much more efficient. As the areas, that need to be monitored in order to see an effect of up to 20 kilometers from the wind farm definitely overlaps between different projects. The Regional Wildlife Science Entity, which is still looking for a new name, by the way, is an effort by NYSERDA, Mass CEC, and various other industry partners, environmental NGOs, state and federal agency partners to address these needs for monitoring across the region so that we can understand the interactions between the natural environment, wildlife, and offshore wind developments. The purpose of this stakeholder-driven process is to help promote the environmentally responsible build-out of offshore wind in a manner that limits impacts to wildlife. Coordinated, standardized wildlife monitoring across the region can help set stakeholder expectations and provide regulatory certainty to developers, ultimately expediting the process and allow us to build out wind energy in an environmentally responsible way and in a way that is efficient. So thank you again for letting me speak to you today about how these, how wildlife and offshore wind interact. We really definitely need offshore wind and renewable energy build out in order to protect wildlife. But we also need to understand that, that there are these interactions and that we do need to protect wildlife as we build out.
Thank you so much, Shiloh. We'll now have some time for a Q&A session. And so if you've been thinking about some questions for our panelists as we've been going along, you can take this opportunity now to raise your hand and ask those. And as you might have just seen, Ben just dropped a link to the report in our chat, and that's where you can find it on our website. So go check it out. Yes, and you can use the hand raising feature to ask a question if you have one. Looks like we've got one.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, hey, thanks. This is Miriam from WBUR. Wondering if someone can talk a little bit about the report that you published today and some of the big takeaways for New England.
Sure, I'm happy to take that on, and thank you for that question, Miriam. Great to have you here. I think some of the big takeaways from this report that we released today when it comes to New England is that New England has some of the strongest, best offshore wind that the entire country has to offer. I mean, we know that Massachusetts has the most offshore wind potential of any state in the US, and that Maine could provide so many times over its electricity needs with offshore wind. So we just know that some of the states here in New England are really big front runners. And we know that there's a really strong potential for collaboration between the New England states, as there are on so many other levels. And we know that by encouraging that regional collaboration, we can ensure the efficient and timely and responsible development of offshore wind. So I think we see a lot of potential for regional collaboration here. And we know that our state leadership can make really big and bold commitments while also ensuring that responsible development at the same time.
And just to briefly add to what Hannah said, I think building off of the remarks of all of our speakers today, we've known for a long time that New England is a leader in the field of offshore wind. So, thinking about the project in Rhode Island off the coast of Block Island, it's already been built. Vineyard Wind, which is set to be the first large-scale offshore wind project to go forward in America. The work of Dr. Dauger and his team at University of Maine to develop floating wind turbine technology. So, all of these projects and efforts are already out there and have already been happening. And what this report shows is that New England is poised to build on those successful efforts to date and really, continue its role as the national leader on offshore wind. And, I think from where I stand in Massachusetts, the report shows that we have enough offshore wind off our coast to generate 20 times as much electricity as the state currently uses. And, similar potential in many of the other New England states as well. So, I think, we're just, we're excited to take this report and really use it to, make the case for the next steps we need in order to go big on offshore wind.
And if any of our panelists would like to jump in on this question, feel free. But looks like we've got a couple of other raised hands.
So I've asked Ben Berkey to unmute himself.
Yeah, hey, I'm Ben Burke from the Rhode Island Public Radio. I've got a question about electric vehicles. I'm wondering, as the nation transitions to using fully electric vehicles over the next 15 years or so, what will that mean for demand for electricity, and what does that portend for the offshore wind industry?
Well, thank you for the question. And as a fellow Rhode Islander, I'll jump in on this one. So I think one important thing to note is that although, I'll say Green Energy Consumers is advocating for legislation and for a phase out of gas cars by 2035. So that kind of fits the 15-year timeline that we'd be imagining. It would be important to note that we still expect gas cars to be on the road, even after, of course, they are not being sold. Most projections indicate that the impact of electric vehicles on demand will be able to be offset by increased energy efficiency through 2030. So it's really after 2030 that we start looking at an uptick in energy demand. We've seen a significant decrease in electricity demand over the past decade or two. That's really due to the success of energy efficiency programs. So the need for a build out of our electric systems to accommodate electric heating and electric transportation is not like a next year we have to do this now thing. However, we are going to have to do it. And offshore wind is a really, really exciting way to meet that demand, in particular because offshore wind is producing the most electricity during the night and when it's cold during the winter. And that's when electric heating systems are drawing the most off of the grid. So offshore wind is a really great resource to meet what we expect to be the biggest sources of electricity demand between 2030 and 2050 and beyond. Offshore wind is going to help us. It's going to be the most necessary, the most crucial resource to meet the growing demand from electric transportation and electric heating. That is something we're thinking about 2030 and beyond for the most part. And that's, I think, why we want to decarbonize the full grid now so that we can start getting that technology in the ground, getting it all up and running as our electricity demand starts to grow in the coming decades.
Maybe I can add a bit to that from a Maine's perspective. The numbers that we've run show that we would need roughly 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity to heat every home and drive every car. So, and that means more than twice the current use of electricity in the state of Maine. So there's going to be a lot of need for between energy efficiency and new generation to create that extra resource.
And I would also just point to the fact that that is something that's reflected in the report and in the data that we're presenting. So I think as Hannah said, the report includes a comparison of our offshore wind potential, both to our current electricity demand, as well as the projected demand in 2050 once our heating and transportation are electrified. And so for Massachusetts, for example, our potential is 20 times our current electricity demand and 8 times our projected demand in 2050. And there's similar figures for all the other states as well.
Yeah, and just to briefly wrap up those comments, we know that for renewable energy to really take a leading place in our energy system, we need that electricity demand to increase. And by that, I just mean we need to shift our focus away from fossil fuels and towards getting our power from electricity. And that's really what's going to help offshore wind take off and be a great complement to those other forms of renewable energy that are already doing such a great job at contributing to our energy system at the moment.
I'm going to ask Doug to unmute to ask the next question.
Great.
So I'm assuming you can hear me, yes?
Yes.
So it has to feel in this particular presentation, but I know the devil's in the details, that, you know, the examination of impacts to species feels like it's lagging behind the planning and construction for the turbines. Once the turbines get permitted, they can go up relatively quickly and be operational. I'm saying relatively compared to like a 15-year permitting process that we looked at. But it can be quick. I'm kind of wondering, I just got the feel from the presentation that, for instance, with the floating offshore turbines, that looked like there was a buoyed line sitting there, like a loop that looked a lot like the loops that they're banning for right whales. For lobster pots, for instance, realizes a big difference in scale, but it still looks somewhat suspicious. And then the bird issues, it seems like there were studies done with birds on the turbines that exist now on land. Are those translatable? Do you have any level of confidence that we won't see suddenly a project that has to be relocated because it's up and running and there's the diversion of massive things of rare shorebirds? It just feels a little bit like there's a story sitting there that I'd rather not write. So just fill me in on those.
Yeah, I can speak to those bird concerns, or one would hope, since I work for Audubon, right? Some of what you hear, some of what we know from onshore wind and risks can be translatable. But what we really focus on at this stage is a planning process that avoids high use areas. So for the most part, the areas where offshore wind is currently planned, the BOEM, lease areas and call areas, are outside of areas of high bird density. So they're far enough offshore that interactions with birds are less likely. There will still be birds that are likely impacted by those projects, but we're really concerned with population level impacts. And so we're trying to limit population level impacts. Because what we really need to be concerned about is climate change and acknowledging that climate change is one of the biggest threats to birds. So we're trying to balance this need for renewable energy to mitigate for climate change effects to wildlife, while still reducing additional sources of pressure to populations. So that's the first step. The second step is that because this is so imperative and this source of energy is so important, for species that are not endangered but are still protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, we want to make sure that we're at least using these initial projects as an opportunity to understand how offshore wind in the United States interacts with birds in the United States. Because the build out in the US is slightly different. You know, we're putting turbines, you know, the construction operation plans for Vineyard Wind, for instance, has turbines that are much farther apart than they are in the UK. And so we really don't know what that looks like in terms of bird interactions. You know, does that mean they'll use the wind turbine areas more and so be less displaced? We really don't know. And so the point is to have these regional monitoring systems in place so that we can use these early developments to understand impacts and not move the turbines afterward, but at least use that to inform our processes going forward and inform plans for construction and operation moving forward. So there are some things that we know and we're building based off of what we know, and then we're trying to push for monitoring that starts early on so that we can have years of data before these projects go in the water to then, as a baseline, to then compare to bird distributions, for instance, after they do end up going into the water.
Maybe I just answer the question on the mooring lines for the floating turbines real quick. Just to give you a sense of scale, there's really no chance for mammal entanglement with these lines. Are too big to do that compared to lobster traps. For example, each chain in that mooring line link, each link in the chain is bigger than your desk. Okay, you're not going to get entangled in that. All right, so it's not like a little wire rope from. So there's been a lot of studies done on potential for whale entanglement by boom, and they don't see that as an issue at all, just because of the sheer size of these mooring lines.
Hannah, I think we're just about out of time, but do you want to take one more question?
Yeah, I think let's take the last one.
Okay, great. So I'll ask Patrick to unmute.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to everyone for doing this. So the focus here is clearly on reducing fossil fuel reliance. Is there anyone who can speak to the role that hydropower could potentially play in this puzzle in New England, since, you know, there are some obviously very much debated hydropower projects in the area at the moment?
Yeah, maybe I could start us off, and then others can feel free to weigh in. So, you know, I think that the role of hydropower in the future of our energy system in New England has been debated, and you know, I think there's people that sort of come down on different sides of this question. You know, certainly a lot of concerns, and I think you know, legitimate concerns that have been raised around the routes of some of the transmission lines that have been proposed to bring power, you know, from Canada into the region. I think the bottom line with this report is that, you know, we have abundant offshore wind resources in our region, and that you know, in many ways, this is really our best local renewable energy resource. And so I think, you know, regardless of where people may come down on the hydropower question, you know, we hope that everybody can agree that we should be moving quickly to tap into our offshore wind potential, because this is really, you know, it's a win for our environment, and it's a win for, you know, more renewable energy generation in the region. So anyway, I think I'll leave it there, and then, yeah, if other folks want to weigh in, please go ahead.
I'd like
briefly. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Anya.
Oh, I was just gonna reiterate that you know, again, yeah, there's a lot of people on many sides about especially the CMP transmission line, and I think that what we can highlight with these findings is, and the offshore wind potential in Maine, is that you know, not only will it bring power specifically to Maine, but it's going to create a lot of opportunity. You know, Maine can really own this sort of power, the jobs, the benefits, it's very localized, and it's something that we can, truly benefit from on all sides, rather than, outsourcing jobs and bringing power not even specifically to Maine. So I just wanted to highlight that's the benefit with, offshore wind here.
That was one of the points I was going to make, that it's local, and that's why we're very focused on it. I think just to emphasize what Ben was saying as well, is that I think we certainly recognize that offshore wind will not be the only renewable energy resource that we'll need to get to a decarbonized world by 2050. And we certainly see that there are multiple renewable energy resources that will need to be at play. And hydro could play a part in that. I think there's a lot of debate as to what scale. Some folks might be more amenable to small scale hydro as opposed to large. But big picture, as Ben and Anya were saying, is that even though it's a piece of the puzzle and that other resources will be needed, the reason that we're really focused on offshore wind is that is the biggest piece of the puzzle, and will likely provide, the state of Massachusetts has found that it will provide 50% of our electricity by 2050, which is huge. And like Anya said, it's because it's local, it's cheaper to transmit the power because it's right where we need it, close to our shores, and would provide a lot of economic benefits as well.
My add from a Maine's perspective, Maine is maxed out on hydro. We can't add any more hydro in Maine. About a quarter of our electricity comes from hydro, roughly. And we've done a lot of studies. Every time we've had a governor, they've commissioned the studies on more hydro in Maine. And the study results always come back the same. We're already maxed out on hydro, at least from a Maine perspective. So.
Great. So I see one more question, and well, I don't want to keep folks over because I know we said we would wrap up by noon. So Hannah, do you think should we just ask people to follow up by email if they have other questions?
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. I think we could probably take just one more potentially, but anyone after that, please follow up via email.
Okay, so I'll ask Sarah to unmute.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much for taking my question. And I may be diving into a deep pool here. I work for a newspaper in Bar Harbor, and there is some real concern from fishermen here of the potential for these turbines to really affect their working environment. And I'm wondering if there's any information in the Rhode Island and Massachusetts area where some have been installed that can speak to whether or not that is affecting fishermen's regions where they're working. And if that information does not exist at this point, that's fine. Also, we will be doing an experiment soon to find out, working with the fisheries, but I'm wondering if there's any current information to speak to that.
To answer one of the more specific questions, I believe that there is some evidence that the deep water wind turbines have become a place of higher or increased activity of marine life because of, it creates a good opportunity for different organisms to latch on to the turbines. However, I think that doesn't necessarily address all of the fishermen's concerns, and the deep water wind project is just 5 turbines in one line, and it's at a much smaller scale than the projects that we're going to be seeing coming. So I think how green energy consumers approaches this in Rhode Island, where we have also heard concerns from commercial fishermen, is that commercial fishermen ought to be part of this process. And we would like offshore wind projects to take steps to minimize the burden on commercial fishermen. We believe that commercial fishermen are a really valuable part of the economy and also symbolic self-conception of what Rhode Island is. And we will have to look to the studies done in places like Europe, where there's been a lot more studies. We trust the Coast Guard study that said that certain specifications on the sizing and placement of the turbines will minimize burdens on the commercial fishermen community, and also are working to open up conversations with that community, especially through our labor partners, to make sure that we can all be working for the protection of commercial fishermen's livelihood and also bringing these offshore wind turbines to Rhode Island. I realize that only addresses a very small portion of your question, but maybe someone else on the call can weigh in with some additional information.
I would agree with Kai and add that we are certainly, as Kai said, pushing for those communities and all affected communities to be involved in the stakeholder engagement process. That is a super important process, and something that I know the state of Maine with their research array is really trying to prioritize and trying to make sure that they are working with the fishing communities to make sure that this works, because just with wildlife, fish have the same issues regarding climate change. If we really need to move forward on offshore wind so that there will be fish to be fished in the future. And we also want to make sure that it works and that it can be sited and developed responsibly so that our commercial fishing industries can continue to do the important work that they do. So not really adding too much to what Kai was saying, but stakeholder engagement is certainly super important and something that has really impacted the process thus far in Massachusetts as well. The commercial fishing industry engaged very deeply with the BOEM process for the initial lease areas off of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And subsequently, the lease areas were reduced by about 40%. They also have given a lot of input to the developers, who then changed the layout so that the turbines would be spaced further apart to create more navigational safety, et cetera. So they've certainly had a really important voice in the process thus far, and we do believe that they should continue to be engaged so that we can mitigate those concerns and make sure it works for everybody.
And I'll just follow up by saying that I put the link for the Maine research array in the chat so that you can share that with any constituents you might have that would be concerned about these issues. I think the state of Maine seems to have been doing a really good job so far trying to engage stakeholders in their process of as they draft their proposal for the project.
There have been a number of Zoom meetings and opportunities for engagement, and I think that there's actually another set coming up. So.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. I want to give a huge thank you to our speakers who joined us on the call. Thank you, Susanna and Shiloh and Kai and Dr. Dauger. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And again, you can find the link to the report that's been dropped in the chat. But thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thanks for coming.